All right, I welcome everyone to this debate. Before we start anything else, I just welcome the adjudicators to introduce themselves and their gender pronouns.
My name is Ellie, my pronouns are she, her.
Hello, I'm Colby, my pronouns are he or they. And I'm gay.
Right, and now we welcome the speakers of the affirmative team to introduce themselves and their speaker positions and their speaker pronouns.
Hi, my name is Chris. I'm first speaker and leaders of my pronouns he, them.
Hi, it's Virginia, I'm second speaker and my pronouns are she, her. Hi, I'm Sarah, I'm the third speaker and pronouns are she, her.
Right, and now we welcome the negating team to introduce themselves and their pronouns, speaker positions.
Hi, I'm Jess. I do first for leaders. My pronouns are she, her. I'm Katie. I do second, and my pronouns are she, her.
I'm Daniel, I'm third, and I'm
All right, if there's nothing else, without further ado, I welcome up the first speaker of the affirmative side.
The opaque system of loosely hidden bribes ostensibly claimed to be political donations is the cause of the corrupt, lobbyist-dominated focus of politicians that is corroding our political system. We stand against this. We stand for equitable distribution of political money by the government. 3 points for the House. First, on characterization of our world and the model. Second, on how this improves the political system. Finally, on how this improves political diversity of parties. First, then, on characterization of model. What do we support? We support a state system of funding that is delineated into two categories, differentiated for new parties and for established parties. For new parties, 4 points of setup. First, we want to note that we would allocate $1,000 or inflation adjusted to all new parties that meet requisite requirements. These are 4 things. The first is that they must register as an official party with the government. The second is that they must demonstrate that they are actively campaigning, whether this is through picketing on the streets or through Instagram advertisements, etc. The third is that once they receive the money, they must demonstrate that they are actively using these funds for those campaign purposes. This could look like taking out advertisements on Instagram, other things that are related to political campaign. Finally, they must demonstrate at least 1,000 supporters through a petition before they can apply. We think this is perfectly reasonable because literally intuitively you can see that, for instance, a lot of live schools have like 3,000 students. We think that any serious political campaign is going to be able to reach that 1,000 threshold. What this does is give these new parties the capacity to actually receive these funds and begin broader campaigning, but also reduce the capacity for bad actors who just want to claim the $1,000 and run. Okay. For established parties, then, we have 2 characteristics to deem as an established. This is either they receive 2% popularity in 3 opinion polls in a year, or in systems with electorates that they win an electorate seat. We think this is fair because of the fact that these established parties either demonstrate that they have broad political consensus or they have support from a particular community. Either is fine as long as they have become this established serious point. Once these characteristics are met, the government will allocate funds proportionate to the degree of party popularity, that is depending on the amount of party popularity that they have, up to a certain extent. That is to say, you aren't going to have these some major parties receive hundreds of millions of dollars more than the others. The amount of money that we consider appropriate would obviously depend on the country in question. The United States is likely to have significantly more funds for this than a smaller country like New Zealand. Okay. Who provides this? An independent authority with the funds distributed in a way that's completely unassociated to the elected government. Overseen similarly, for instance, to the independence of the Reserve Bank or the distribution of money to news agencies like the BBC, which are mostly state-funded but still independent and report constantly against the government. They're independent in that sense. What this means is the government will have no influence on the money brokering. They won't be able to influence that. And we think it would be unstrategic to contest that for 2 reasons. First, given that Western liberal democracies independently fund things like the BBC all the time. And second, that political parties can obviously complain if they feel as though they've been inequitably treated. We think that in any system with a free media, that is likely to be fine enough to reduce this capacity for government corruption. We observe here that the amount of money received by major parties is probably likely to decrease. We see this because parties like the Democratic and Republican Party in the US are now literally spending hundreds of millions of dollars, and parties like in New Zealand, such as National Labour, already receive significantly more money than these smaller parties. But we also think that small parties will see a large increase in the amount of money for reasons I'll go on to later. But first, just I wanted to flag why we support this. 3 things. The first is to say that large parties have become increasingly bureaucratic. They've become literally black holes of money where you're unable to see where this money is going to, where it's coming from, what it's being spent for. The second is that this is a self-perpetuating cycle. That is, the more money the Democratic Party spends, the more money the Republican Party must spend to outcompete them on fundraising slots on primetime television. The final thing is, they often lock out revenue streams to small parties. This looks like the fact that they often control rich listers because of the fact that they support policies such as tax cuts that rich people will support, that small parties often campaign against. For instance, the Green Party campaigning for a wealth tax is not going to be supported in the vast majority of instances by wealthy people. And we think even if there are exceptions to this, this is the general rule, and this is the rule that is harming our political systems. Okay, second then, on how this improves the political system. Context. What are the harms of private donations? We see this as three things. The first is to say that they're incredibly opaque. As I flagged earlier, it is often difficult for the public to know who is funding who and where this money is going to. The second is that there's an increased capacity for these rich parties. Obviously, the Democratic or Republican parties with associations from law school or the elite school that they go to are more likely to have the connections to get support from other rich people and elites than a small party, a grassroots party. The third is the increased degree of political lobbying. This looks like the close relationships between party leaders and other MPs with these oil companies, with these large executives who have a huge fund of slosh money that they distribute out in order to gain political favors. The impacts of this is the current political system is built on the ability to cozy up the political supporters and mega rich listers. It looks like lobbyists roaming the halls of Congress and Parliament, essentially handing out cash for favorable votes and laws. And we know that this is through the donation system itself, because of the fact that directly giving money to politicians is ostensibly illegal in most countries, but then packaging this money into a super PAC or into a donation or shell company, and then giving it the money with the guise of a donation is perfectly legal. We stand completely against this. We think the problem with any system to control this is that they've been tried, and the problem is they are still opaque, they're still worse for political corruption. However, we also think that this is the society that is so dependent on donations from lobbyists because of the fact there is also self-perpetuating the cycle of having to need more money. As I say, if money is equitably distributed to a limit, parties can no longer outcompete each other on funds. This means that they no longer have to take out as many primetime television stars as possible through as much money as they can possibly raise, because they're more likely to have a limit to the money that they've raised from the government. They're more likely to spend this more equitably. What this looks like is the fact that primetime television slots are expensive, and currently a strategy that many political parties have is simply to pour as much money and fundraising as possible into getting as many slots as possible. This allows them to run fear-mongering campaigns like immigrants are coming to steal your jobs, or the Democrats are going to take away your God-given rights, or on the other side, that all national MPs are here to take away the sanctity of life and abortion debate, other issues like this. What this means is there's less focus on actual policy, more focus on out-competing and out-fronting. We stand against that. I'll take that point.
Do you not believe that having essentially more exposure through competing for these primetime spots is good because you get people understanding the policy?
No, absolutely not. Because at the current status quo, it is literally big parties leveraging as much fundraising as possible to pump out barrages and barrages of mindless content that is fear-mongering, not actual policy. This occurs uniquely in a world where you have these political donations that are huge because of the fact that they must necessarily outcompete each other without these limits. That is a race when you have equitable and limited distribution by the government. Okay, how do we solve this? Three things. The first is obviously reduce reliance on donations to the point they can't have it. Second is a decrease in funding for all major parties that is symmetric, meaning they can't outcompete each other. Finally, they aren't hidden by bureaucracy and the necessity to outspend. Finally then, how does this improve political diversity? Okay, why are small parties so obscure in the status quo? We see this as two things. The first is an inability to outcompete huge major funds of major parties, but second, no upwards mobility. This is, as I noted earlier, parties like the Opportunity Party or the Greens campaigning on wealth taxes are not going to be able to raise as much money as ACT, who is also a smaller party but campaigns for a wealth tax, so campaigns for against taking wealth, right? What this means is you have certain parties that are much more leveraged to take advantage of these ostensive donations in order to rise to the top. This means that parties either have to, one, change their morals, which stands against the principles of democracy, or two, not have as much funding and competing. This means that you necessarily get less political diversity. We solve this at the point there's a more equitable distribution. For a political system that isn't dependent on lobbyists, that isn't obscuring the voices of millions, stand with side proposition.
opposition is unable to get a better world for their voter base when they have less money to put into their policies. 3 points for the House today. Firstly, why they get worse resource allocation. Secondly, why this is particularly harmful in weak democracies, looking at it from a global context. And then Katie's going to extend and tell you why lobbying still exists in the alternative. Before that, some rebuttal. I think the first thing to note is even if they've got a system which is really separate from the government, you still have to take that money from your taxpayers, which means you have less money for your resource allocation. But secondly, in a context with like a weak democracy, no matter the level of separation, there is probably still some type of corruption, which means that that money isn't as separate as what you were trying to portray. And this like perpetuates the harm because now people don't realize how corrupt the government is because they think they are being funded independently of the government itself. But secondly, when they were trying to tell you that you get less donations and therefore the competition no longer exists, essentially what we tell you here is that competition leads to exposure, which you need for people to understand the enactment of your policy, because the more time you have, the more time you can explain it well. But the fear-mongering actually is perpetuated and gets worse on their side of the house when you now have less money to buy less television slots, so therefore you are doing far more harmful policies to really push home your point in the limited time that you have. And then I think the last thing that they try to prove is that you get a lot of political lobbying. What we say to that, and Katie is going to extend, but when you are trying to appeal to a large proportion of your of the public, they're probably going to constitute a large block of your voters, and therefore you're still going to fold to their needs because you want them to vote for you. Okay, moving on to our first point, which is why you get worse resource allocation. This point is 2-pronged. The first point is that you decrease funding to enact welfare policies. Private donations are going to be what funds your campaign. And that looks like setting up your political party to deal with issues, whereas the enactment of policies is done through taxpayer money. When you have state funding, it means that all of this is being done through taxpayer money. So now not only is there less money because your tax citizens can only pay a certain amount before it becomes disproportional and they start to complain, which is obviously bad because as a political party you want people to vote for you. But secondly, your money decreases because you're now spending it on campaigning, which is taking away from the money that you're getting from the tax to spend on those policies. Comparatively, private donations are a separate pool of money, so you're not dipping into funds which should be used for welfare, but B, private donations is a larger accumulation of money because people who fund campaigns are wealthy as they're willing to put that money into the party, and it's likely to be a party that aligns with their political interests. Therefore, it means that you have more money in our world, and therefore in their world it harms the average person. Why? Firstly, because policies which are enacted are far worse simply because you have less funding. This means you're going to be doing the cost-effective version of the policy. This looks like hospital care getting far worse because you can no longer afford to pay your nurses because a significant proportion of your money is going into that funding. But it also looks like teachers having less pay. Teachers are already striking. They're probably not going to be happy with this policy either. This is a significant amount of your voter base, which you are now really annoying. But secondly, we just see that your allocation of resources gets far worse. It means that you've got less money to give to people on the benefit. Why? Because as we've proven to you, that money just decreases. The second prong of this point then is that you get less diversity within your parties, which actually directly opposes what they try to tell you. So logically, in the alternative, like we heard, money gets allocated to parties who have the most amount of power and is given proportionally based on popularity. This means even with their $1,000, which sets off your voter base, you actually just get less money for a smaller party to become established because $1,000 isn't very much, especially if they try to tell you that primetime television slots are really, really expensive. It means they could maybe get one instead of if they were privately funded, they could get 2 or 3. This means that less funds are given to them for campaigning, and campaigning is integral for the party's success. Why? 4 reasons. A, it allows for the party to become known, which is just really important to get your policies out there. B, it allows the party to become, because parties are elected off of policies, if no one knows about your policy, you're probably not going to be elected. C, voters engage with parties whose campaigning is really fun and really engaging because no one wants to read through your 500-page long thesis of what your party is going to do. They want really fun infographic slides or an interactive slide, which actually takes a level of skill, and therefore you're going to have to hire someone with that skill, which is going to cost you money. But D, parties aren't guaranteed the same level of funding in the comparative, which means that they can't actually promise to make really big changes because they don't know if they have the ability to do that because some of the money they get from private donations probably like rolls over into them being able to enact their policies. So what is the harms of having less smaller parties? It means that less people are represented, especially in minorities. For example, like you get less representation of ethnic minority interests. Why? Because the government has an obligation to minorities because the government holds an asymmetrical amount of power over these people, especially considering like they enact the laws and everything else. And especially because of colonial and historical harms, they have a greater obligation to look after these people. But secondly, minority parties also have the right of speech to be heard in the government, and smaller parties typically represent those minority people, and therefore when you have a harm on those those smaller parties, you have a harm on those minority people. Comparatively, when parties are only state funded, you probably do have a bigger focus on the majority, which is what like your bigger parties represent, because more votes are attained by having policies which appeal to the majority, because like having like more voters just means you can be voted in, obviously aligns with the incentive of a party. Yes, I'll take your point.
I am a Labour MP that believes in wealth distribution. Am I more likely to campaign for a wealth tax in a world where I share retribution from rich donors, or a world where my party money comes from the government?
I think that people that support Labour, like in general, considering that the wealth inequality things is a massive part of their like campaigning, someone that's likely to fund Labour probably supports that policy because it's like integral to Labour's identity. We see that like if you're going to have a donor that doesn't agree with you, they're not going to fund you, they're going to fund another party. Okay, secondly though, why it's particularly harmful for this policy to be enacted in the context of weak democracy. When a government who is in power is corrupt and claims to be a democracy, for example like Turkey, this policy allows the current leader to maintain a level of power which they wouldn't be able to in the status quo. Why is this? Firstly, because the government in power probably has some type of power over the allocation of resources or can manipulate the resources by like essentially saying to the party whether or not it is directly like correlated with them that they are going to like stop funding going into that like organization if they don't like align with what that party wants, because they are corrupt, they don't have that same level of efficacy that what you'd get in a Western world. But so this means that more funding goes to that party. This means a couple of things. A, any opposition is unable to campaign and gather the same level of support as what they would if private donors were involved. But B, it actually undermines the power of the opposition because they can't even source the funding to campaign, and so therefore it's really difficult to trust that that party can rule your government if they're at such a disadvantage already. But see, that party just get less exposure because without adequate funds, they're unable to travel across cities to connect with the average person, because in like countries that are particularly on like the verge of weak democracy, there's probably some level of state censorship in terms of social media, so they cannot access those means to be able to campaign in a really like good way. But it also means that they just like can't house events, whether it's in their party, because they cannot pay to have that infrastructure. This means that there's less likely for change to occur and for like the opposition party, like in Turkey, to get enough support to be like an adequate forerunner for their opposition, or like in Thailand, where the opposition party has just been elected into power. You no longer get these changes, which is way worse for the people on the ground because they continue to live under an oppressive regime with no ways to change it. We side with the average person. We side with private donors.
Thank you, first speaker from the Negating side for that speech, and now we welcome up second affirmative. Yeah.
Chris told you it would be unstrategic to contest the fact that this is likely to work relatively well in most functioning democracies. But we heard from Negating that, oh my god, these democracies are still really weak. Both we've already responded to this, and also corruption is always going to be symmetric in these places. If there is a bunch of corruption in the system, it doesn't really make that much of a difference where that corruption comes from or how specifically it works. People being influenced by things other than the voters. This is really bad. The reasons, that they've agreed to. Okay, 3 things to talk about today. First on characterization, second on the economy, and third on how this, and third my substantive contribution on how this hugely increases policy-based campaigning. Okay, first on First, on characterization, we'd like to note that most of these, this likely takes place in these strong functioning democracies. This likely takes place in these places where these are likely to happen. But also, I'd like to note that political parties on either side have the same incentives of campaigning. Political parties on either side have the same incentives of campaigning. Okay.
On that point.
Okay. Also, why this? Okay. I'm also going to talk about why these political parties are likely to still get the same amount of reach that they would under the status quo, and I'll go into later how it's likely to be higher quality. Okay, first, we have more diversity is likely to draw out more voters. We have more diverse political parties, we have better campaigning, which we'll also go into later, and this is likely to draw out more voters. But second, we prefer having a system where we have marginally less massive amounts of campaigning, and it is actually better campaigning. We tell you, you do not need the huge bloated amounts of money that you have in the system. It is not beneficial for voters to see the same billboard every 4 blocks that has a massive Labour logo on it. This does not actually meaningfully increase education, and we still get the same amount of education. It just happens in much more efficient amounts. Okay. Moving into how this impacts the economy. Okay. We've heard from side negating that a bunch of money, that now we're spending tons and tons of money, and this is really, really bad for the economy. Okay, 3 reasons the economy is likely to get better. First of all, we get a better run government. We have already told you these governments are, they're likely to be campaigning on policy. They're likely to be trying harder. They're likely to be not just funded by these massive, really rich corporations, but focusing more on the actual quality of their policy, and so they're likely to spend less wasted amounts of money, less, like bureaucratic things. Second, there's likely going to be a lot more money in the system. Chris has already told you that, like things like the wealth tax are much more likely to get in. Things like spending, things like efforts to get more money, such as taxes, such as other things that are opposed, are simply less likely to happen, and so this is made up for by more things in the system. But also, we still benefit even if there's slightly more money is spent on these if slightly more money is spent by the government, because the reason that but it's bad for this money to be spent and wasted is, as I said, things like quality of life, things like it being really, really bad because you can't spend money on doctors, on nurses, on things like that. And we tell you that what most improves the quality of life is things like actually good policy, things like having policymakers that are writing things that actually benefit those that they are campaigning for. This is likely to have a much larger increase on quality of life, especially because it applies in all areas. Small amounts of money are likely, maybe they're not spent on doctors, maybe they're not spent on nurses, things like that. However, this improvement in quality of life will literally apply to every single area of the government. That is much better run. Political systems are absolutely foundational to society and quality of life. Okay, moving into how this impacts policy-based campaigning. Okay, a few things to note at the beginning. First, that wealth, the idea of a wealth tax was not responded to. Okay. Also, okay, what does the status quo look like? We've already told you, parties spend a lot of money on all these huge decorative ads, all these, huge excessive amounts of ads. What's really, really bad about that is it means that they're doing things like fear mongering. They're convincing people to vote for them by things like by normalizing these as we've seen, extremist ideas, but also just by normalizing these big ideologies, saying, oh yeah, everyone's voting for us. They make this illusion by putting all these billboards everywhere, by making it seem like they're really normal. They're the people that are generally voted for, and this is really, really expensive. It's most expensive, but also quite effective way to vote is to do all this fear mongering. Do all this campaigning, make it seem like everyone should vote for them. Okay.
Point.
As I've already said, this is unlikely. Now that they have, okay. As I've said, the incentives are still the same. The incentives to capture all these votes are still the same, so they're still likely to continue to do other policy, other things. How do small parties campaign under the status quo? Under the status quo, small parties are they simply do not have the resources to do this kind of campaigning, and so they have to resort to policy-based campaigning. They have to get people, they have to capture. You have to actually get people to agree with them and believe in their policies so that they can get these votes, so that so that they have this power. Secondly, they're likely to campaign on policy because they're likely to be very, very passionate in order to support these parties. They're likely to have very, very passionate views on these things. Small parties are often likely to be really grassroots parties, people that really, really care enough about politics, because if people are super motivated to just get as much power as possible, they're likely to go and work for these bigger companies where they can immediately get more power rather than potentially long-term, develop something that they're super, super passionate about. Okay, what does this mean? In the absence of other possibilities, and to compete with these smaller parties, bigger parties have to campaign on policy. They can no longer afford to have one billboard every 4 blocks, and so they have to switch to a form of advertising where one billboard with ideas people really, really agree with is enough. Okay, I'll take a POI now. Why do you think that you're less likely to get fear-mongering if that's like the most effective way to get people to vote for you and now you don't have as much funds? Because fear-mongering takes so many funds. Fear-mongering simply does not work if it only has a few billboards, because it is foundational on the fact that this is a really big deal, that it's huge, that it's important, that you should be thinking about it all the time, and that everyone agrees with you and everyone is right. That is foundational to the way that it works, and when they simply cannot do this, they have to pick another, another thing to happen. Okay, what does this campaigning on policy means? First, it means that people believe are more likely to vote for what they actually support and believe in, right? People aren't just voting, because they believe that this party is totally the right way to go. It's because they actually believe that this will help them. And okay, 2 impacts of this. First, it principally helps the system be more democratic. Principally, it is a much more democratic system, and that is, like a really important goal for a democratic system, and that is, like a current important goal of the democratic system. And second, because people are actually voting for what they want, they're likely to get better outcomes for the majority. If people are all voting for things that that help them and are actually likely to help them, they're more likely policy that does actually support these people is likely to go through. And also because there is such a focus on policy campaigning, people are more likely to put more effort into writing policy that does actually help here. Okay, I also like to note here that they tried to characterize things, this huge amount of money being spent on things like interactive slides. However, as I've said, if fear-mongering is the easiest way to do it, that's what they're going to do, and that is the easiest thing to do with significant amount of power, and it has so much harm that we have to avoid this at absolutely any cost.
Within the seconds, we will need a closing slide for the speech, and now we welcome up second again.
Note that the Affirmative team's case is completely dependent on the fact that they are getting good policies. And just as proof to you why, you actually have less money in this fund pool, which means that you have no money left to make actual good policies because you're spending it all on campaigning. 3 things I'll do in the speech. Firstly, on what are the harms on the citizens and the parties. Secondly, on the party's ability to campaign. And thirdly, on my split, which is why this causes government disdain for citizens. So firstly, on what are the harms on the citizens and the party. So here I'm going to directly engage on the point on lobbying and like bribery, and also on the point on like primetime TV. So we tell you why. They're telling us that a lot of lobbying will occur on our side due to the private companies, but here's why it doesn't actually happen as much on our side as they try to prove. And essentially, we tell you that corruption and bribery occurs on both sides, and this is why it occurs. So why did they also get lobbying? It's because these parties still want the votes from these large corporations. These large corporations have so many like workers. They're probably just your average Joe. So they also care about like what party their company is going for, and therefore like this voice actually matters. So the money that are used to support the parties are also used for like it's also as in, the voters are just as important as the money, which means that like the parties still have to appear. This is a certain group of people in these private companies, which mean they can't just like be hugely like bribe their way through, because these companies are reliant on a ton of workers. They're not just like that rich man standing at the top. Now we tell you how this like they say how the minority party and how there's going to be this like social upward mobility. So so $1,000 probably won't be sufficient enough for advertising, as people don't actually get to know who you are, like, and what the party actually stands for. All you really do is just say, oh, this is our party, like these are the things we stand for, but you don't actually go into depth with the amount of policies you're able to give. So you're not actually having these small parties at all. On our side, when you have these comparatively on our side, when you have these private companies, it's likely that, like, say if one small party is getting up and they're supporting the farmers, then likely the whole like farming industry and all the big corporations in there will support this, which means that they will get a much larger amount of money than just $1,000, which you simply, in this world with inflation, you cannot do anything, and you cannot do, like, even if you're accounting for inflation, it means that like this $1,000 is probably going to buy you like one ad or one billboard, which is not sufficient for anything, and so it actually doesn't benefit these small parties. Now onto their characterization. So we tell you that, like, in weak democracies, you're actually going to be unable to, like, the opposition parties are unable to get any amount of ability to have control, because the government in power controls the state pool. They will be able to manipulate the amount of money that goes into these opposition parties. They're not going to give them that amount to campaign. They're going to keep it all to themselves. Comparatively on side, when we have the private companies that are supporting the opposition, the workers are here, they're the average worker, you're increasing this competition because you're enabling them to have support outside of just like taxpayers' money, because we know that when you have these corrupt governments and these like dictatorships or just really weak democracies, those people in power are just going to be like controlling the amount of money is given to the opposition power, which means that in reality they're not actually going to have this amount of competition, and therefore they're not helping anyone in these citizens, these weak democracies, to actually be uplifted. And they also tell us how, like, it will increase like the policy-based campaigning and how parties will spend a lot of money. They tell you this whole thing that governments like have this fear-mongering and stuff, but we tell you that fear-mongering doesn't actually look like billboards. It looks like undercutting another party in an interview or an like incentive, which is more likely to limit opportunity to make your own like party look better than another. So we feel like this characterization is not true. And to engage with the quality of life argument, we also get good policies. We get good policies on our side, as Jess has like told you very well through her first point, because of the allocation of resources. So they have more money to make these good policies. When you just give them the small amount of money from the public fund, the taxpayers' money, you only have that limited capacity to give them all the support, which is why you're not actually able to actually take action with these policies. So now onto this second point of clash, which is like the ability of a company to campaign. So there's actually, they tell us how there's that we tell you that there's this greater like allocation of resources on our side, and this is because of that competition leads to exposure, which Jess has developed on. So when you have more resources on your side, you have more like we have more resources on our side, which means we have more ability to not only campaign but also give like the hire people to have these like descriptive info slides, which give understanding and depth to their policy descriptions. This is so important because the citizens that voting, they need to know what a party is standing for. When you don't give them that amount, because taxpayers have such a limited capacity to actually like fund these like parties and the smaller parties, then you're not actually getting the depth of policy descriptions. I'll take that POI now.
Earlier you mentioned that governments will have less funds for policies. Are you aware that the funds donated to political parties are not the actual taxpayer funds used to implement policies, therefore that makes sense?
Well, where are they getting the money from then? Because essentially, like, all the money in the public fund and like to give to these like parties to raise to power, then they're like the taxpayers' money. There is no other place when you're taking out private companies to be actually getting this money from to support a policy. I'm not quite sure where they're going with this here. Now I'm going to move onto my split, which is why this causes more government disdain from the citizens. And note this is important because these citizens are on the receiving end of their like policies and also their campaigns. So citizens of the country will want to support their choice of party rather than the two largest or the opposition to their choice of vote. So when a political party is being state funded, this money is coming from directly from taxpayers' money. So this looks like if a citizen was supportive of like Green Party, for example, they would want to support the Green Party's campaign, but because all of the taxpayers' money is just going to this fund and then being allocated like directly like by proportion of the amount of members, it means that they will be ending up supporting like parties like National and Labour, which they won't necessarily like support in terms of votes and what they believe in. So there's no logical reason as to how certain taxpayers' tax will be directly given to like this party they support, which means that citizens will be influenced infuriated because they're unable to support their smaller party because all this taxpayers' money that's going in, a small percentage is going to be used on the campaigns, but they don't want the campaigns to go to like a Nationals campaign or Labour's campaign, depending on what they stand for. And we tell you that in the status quo, there is far less government on disdain on our end, because on their end, they're like increasing this disdain by the way they're allocating the taxpayers' money. And this is so essential in the debate. And I proved to you why citizens will be angered when you just only have like public funds. Okay, now I'll move on to the impacts of this. So basically, citizens will feel less represented, which means they feel like they have more distrust in their government. It's simply because people care about what their money does. A lot of political ideas are based around like what happens to their tax. So when you do this, the governments are just going to be the people on the receiving end of their services are just going to be mad of like the way the resources are allocated, but also because their money is going to like go into the developing of policies of like say for example national, which they do not support at all. It also means that citizens may feel less educated or less feel like they're not getting enough admittance or understanding of the political issue on like one political party, just because they don't when you're getting like a public fund, you don't have the capacity to get like hire a bunch of people for info slides, hire them for like social media marketing, hire them for billboards, like and like telling them like what their party believes in. So basically we've proved to you why this actually helps a party and a smaller party's ability to campaign, and the massive harms it has on the citizens, and then the relationship between the government and the citizens, which is why we are very proud to negate.
Speech, and I will stop the Affirmative. Here.
Today, Negating wants governments to operate in order to appease their private funders, not the voters of this nation, not the very citizens of this country. We believe this is egregious, and they completely down the line do not respond to all we gave you at Chris and at Virginia. We strongly believe that parties must be state funded. We heard, first of all, at Jess that parties will now have this incentive to gain majority vote because of the fact they're not funded. We tell you this is really good for democracy. This is really good for our nation, because now parties don't just have to accept the lobbyists of these oil companies, we told you, Chris, accept the lobbyists of the people that don't want to pay extra to avoid dumping in our very green land. We tell you it is principally egregious to think now, principally egregious to give up on democracy just because we get a little bit of funding. We stand for democracy on our side of the house. We stand for actual voter engagement. 3 things to do my speech. First of all, which side of the house improves voter engagement within the democracy? Whoever wins this point, I think, deserves to win the debate, as this is the greatest path to victory, and also is contingent on which side gets better policy. And third of all, should we spend this funds on campaigning? Okay, firstly, on voter engagement. They told us that minorities have a really strong obligation from the government to be heard. Okay, well in the US, 60% of the people don't actually participate, and we get extremely low turnout from disenfranchised groups because they don't think that there's any party that could represent them. They never hear of other parties. They never see other parties. They don't think there even is a party for them, and they will always think that these big parties with a lot of money who are funded by these rich people will get the votes. They get less trust in the government because they're like, oh, look at that oil oligarch funding that party. They don't want to turn up. They never hear of other parties. There's less competition, a totally worse democracy. On our side of the house, we get people actively more engaged at the point we have more parties, at the point we have actually, instead of parties literally getting a better voice based on how much money they have, because now they can buy out all the billboards, we have better competition because now less money as a whole is spent. Now we get things like everyone having at least an equal playing field, a more equal playing field, to ensure they can all get a billboard of some sort, or they can all have their voices heard, rather than them being crowded out by one big party and no one ever hearing of these other things.